Chicago, Illinois, a night in late April 1963. 11:40 p.m. Malcolm X sat in a parked car outside a modest brick house on the south side, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at a lit window 2 stories up. He had driven from the airport directly here, skipping the hotel, skipping the temple, skipping every protocol that normally governed a visit to the man he called the messenger of Allah. For 12 years, Malcolm had been Elijah Muhammad's most devoted servant, the architect of the nation of Islam's public voice, the man who had taken a fringe religious movement and turned it into a force that commanded national attention. He had built temples. He had recruited thousands. He had defended Elijah Muhammad against every accusation, every skeptic, every reporter who tried to suggest the messenger was anything less than what he claimed to be. But 3 days earlier, in a quiet conversation with 2 ministers from Los Angeles, Malcolm had heard something he could not unhear, specific, detailed, impossible to dismiss as mere rumor. Allegations that Elijah Muhammad had fathered children with multiple young secretaries within the nation's own offices, women barely out of their teens, employees of the organization that preached strict moral discipline as its foundation. Malcolm had spent 3 sleepless nights trying to find a way to make the allegations false. He couldn't. He got out of the car. He walked up the path. He knocked on the door at 11:47 p.m. When Elijah Muhammad opened it himself, surprised to see his most trusted minister standing there unannounced at this hour, Malcolm said only, "I need to ask you something, and I need the truth." 3 hours later, when Malcolm walked back down that path to his car, the people who knew him best, his wife Betty, his closest aides, even casual associates who saw him the following days, all said the same thing in different words. Something had changed, not just his understanding, something deeper, something in the architecture of his belief that could not be rebuilt the way it had been before. To understand what happened in that house, you have to understand what Elijah Muhammad represented to Malcolm before that night. Malcolm had discovered the teachings of the Nation of Islam while incarcerated at Norfolk Prison Colony in the late 1940s, introduced through his brother Reginald's letters describing a man who taught that white society had systematically destroyed black dignity and that redemption required total moral discipline. No drugs, no alcohol, no promiscuity, no theft, no disrespect. A complete reconstruction of self through faith and discipline. For Malcolm, who had spent his adolescence and early 20s as Detroit Red, a hustler consumed by exactly the vices Elijah Muhammad condemned, the message arrived with the force of resurrection. Here was a path out of the person he had been. Here was a framework that explained his rage and gave it purpose and direction rather than leaving it to burn destructively inward and outward without aim. Here was, perhaps most importantly, a father figure, because Elijah Muhammad explicitly positioned himself as a spiritual father to men who had lost or never had real paternal guidance, which described Malcolm with painful precision. His own father, Earl Little, had been murdered by white supremacists when Malcolm was 6 years old. His body found on streetcar tracks under circumstances a family always believed were deliberate murder disguised as accident. His mother, Louise, had been institutionalized when Malcolm was 13, taken from the family home by state welfare workers after years of grief and poverty, had worn her down past what the system was willing to accommodate. Malcolm had spent his entire adolescence and young adulthood without anyone occupying the role Elijah Muhammad now claimed to fill. The hunger for that role to be real, for someone to finally be the steady moral authority his own childhood had been denied, was not incidental to Malcolm's devotion. It was foundational to it. When Malcolm was paroled in 1952, he went directly into the Nation of Islam's orbit and never looked back. He rose faster than anyone in the organization's history, becoming minister of Temple No. 7 in Harlem by 1954 and the nation's most visible national spokesman within a few years after that. By 1963, he was unquestionably Elijah Muhammad's most visible, most articulate, most internationally recognized minister. And his loyalty was not merely political or organizational. It was filial, structured by the deepest psychological architecture of man who had finally found the father he'd been missing since age 6. He called Elijah Muhammad the messenger with the same reverence others reserve for religious founders. He defended him absolutely, against every accusation, treating skepticism about Elijah's character as an attack on truth itself, and perhaps, though Malcolm could not have articulated this at the time, as an attack on the fragile architecture of his own healed identity. The rumors that reached Malcolm in April 1963 did not arrive as a single dramatic revelation. They accumulated, the way poison accumulates, in small doses that the body tries to process and reject before finally succumbing to what it can no longer deny. Malcolm had heard whispers for over a year, comments dismissed as jealousy from rival ministers, allegations attributed to disgruntled former members with grudges. He had developed, almost unconsciously, a series of mental defenses against information that threatened the foundation his entire adult identity rested upon. But in April 1963, two ministers from the Los Angeles Temple, men Malcolm trusted, men with no apparent motive for fabrication, sat with him and described something specific, not vague rumor, names, dates, children born to specific secretaries who worked in the nation's Chicago headquarters, paternity that had been quietly acknowledged within a small circle and aggressively suppressed from wider knowledge. The specificity was what broke through Malcolm's defenses. Vague allegations could be dismissed. This could not. Malcolm listened to the two ministers describe what they knew, and something in his chest. He later told a confidant, felt like the floor of a building giving way beneath him while the walls remained standing, an internal collapse invisible from outside, structural failure happening silently beneath an intact facade. For 3 days after hearing the allegations, Malcolm tried every mental strategy available to a man desperate to preserve a belief system that organized his entire post-prison existence. He told himself the ministers might be wrong. He told himself even if some were true, perhaps it was exaggerated, distorted by retelling. He told himself that even if Elijah Muhammad had failed morally in his personal life, this did not necessarily invalidate the theological framework, the organizational achievement, the genuine transformation the nation had produced in thousands of broken men exactly like Malcolm himself had once been. He turned the question over and over, looking for an angle that would let him continue believing what he needed to believe. But Malcolm was, above all things, a man who could not lie to himself for long. It was the same intellectual rigor that made him formidable in debates and devastating in his analysis of American racism that now turned inward and refused to let him rest in comfortable uncertainty. By the third night, he had made a decision. He would not ask anyone else. He would not investigate through intermediaries. He would go directly to Elijah Muhammad and ask him, man to man, face to face, whether the allegations were true. He booked a flight to Chicago that same night. The drive from O'Hare to the South Side took 35 minutes. Malcolm did not call ahead. This was itself a violation of protocol. Visits to the messenger were typically arranged through his secretaries, scheduled, formalized. Malcolm understood that arriving unannounced at midnight communicated something before he even said a word. It communicated urgency that could not wait for morning. It communicated that whatever he needed to discuss was not a matter that could be filtered through the normal channels of organizational hierarchy. He parked outside the house and sat for several minutes, according to his own later account, simply breathing, trying to settle something in himself before approaching the door. He had spent 12 years building his entire identity around absolute deference to this man. He was now about to ask a question that implicitly challenged that deference. The cognitive distance between Minister Malcolm X, loyal servant of the messenger, and Malcolm Little, a man demanding truth from someone who might have profoundly betrayed everything he claimed to represent, was enormous, and Malcolm had to cross it in the time it took to walk from his car to the front door. Elijah Muhammad answered the door himself. He was 65 years old, smaller in person than his public presence suggested, dressed in house clothes, clearly not expecting visitors. His expression shifted from confusion to something more guarded when he saw who was standing on his porch at this hour. Malcolm later described the moment with characteristic precision. I looked at his face, and I already knew. Before he said anything, I could see it. Elijah invited him in. They went to a small study on the ground floor. Malcolm did not sit immediately. He stood near the door for a moment, and then he asked the question he had crossed half a continent to ask. Is it true? The children, the secretaries. I need to know if it's true. Elijah Muhammad did not deny it immediately. This, Malcolm would later say, was almost more devastating than an outright confession would have been. The pause before any response, the visible calculation happening behind Elijah's eyes, the moment where Malcolm watched a man deciding how much truth he could afford to release. What was said in that room over the next 3 hours has never been fully documented. Malcolm spoke about it later only in fragments, to a small number of trusted confidants. And even those accounts vary in detail and emphasis. What is consistent across every version is the broad shape of what occurred. Elijah Muhammad did not deny the affairs. He offered instead a theological justification, an interpretation of biblical precedent involving prophets who had multiple wives and children outside conventional marriage structures, suggesting that his behavior fell within a framework of divine exception that ordinary moral rules did not constrain. He spoke about the burdens of leadership, about needs that men in his position experienced, about the difference between the rules necessary for ordinary believers and the latitude available to one who occupied his unique spiritual role. Malcolm listened. He asked questions. He pressed for specifics, for accountability, for some acknowledgement that what had happened constituted a violation of the very moral framework the nation demanded from every member. According to multiple later accounts, Elijah Muhammad never fully apologized. He explained. He justified. He invoked precedent and exception. But he did not say the words Malcolm needed to hear, that he had failed the people who trusted him, that the hypocrisy between public teaching and private behavior was a wound, that he understood what this meant for the thousands of men and women who had reconstructed their entire lives around moral standards he himself had not maintained. Around 2:30 a.m., Malcolm stood up to leave. The conversation had not ended in resolution. It had ended in exhaustion, in the particular fatigue that comes after hours spent trying to reconcile two truths that cannot coexist. Elijah Muhammad walked him to the door. What was said in those final moments is even less documented than the conversation itself. But Malcolm later indicated that Elijah had asked him, in effect, to carry this knowledge privately, to continue serving the nation's mission despite what he now knew about his leader's personal conduct, to separate the message from the messenger's failures. Malcolm walked back to his car. He sat in the driver's seat for several minutes before starting the engine, according to the account he later gave to a close associate. He did not cry. He did not rage. He described the feeling later as something closer to a kind of internal silence, the particular quiet that exists after something is finished breaking and there is nothing left to break further. He drove back to the airport in that silence. He flew home in that silence. And when Betty met him at the door of their home, she later said she knew immediately, before he said a single word, that something fundamental had shifted. He looked the same, she said, but he wasn't the same. Something behind his eyes had moved. In the weeks that followed, Malcolm did not immediately break with the Nation of Islam. The public timeline of his departure would not begin in earnest until later that year, accelerated by his suspension following the comments about President Kennedy's assassination in November 1963. But people close to him in the months after the midnight visit to Chicago consistently described a man who was performing loyalty rather than feeling it. His speeches retained their power, but associates noted a new quality of distance. As though Malcolm were speaking words he still believed in service of an organization he could no longer fully trust. He continued defending Elijah Muhammad publicly while privately confiding to a small circle that he now understood the messenger to be, in his words, a man, not a prophet, and a man who had failed in exactly the ways he taught others not to fail. This private knowledge, carried silently for months while Malcolm continued his public duties, created a particular kind of psychological strain that several biographers and historians point to as a contributing factor in the eventual, more public rupture. The midnight conversation in Chicago was not the public break, but it was a private one. It was the moment the foundation cracked, even though the building above it continued standing for a while longer as if nothing had changed. The eventual public split between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad, finalized in March 1964, has been documented extensively in terms of its political and organizational dimensions. The suspension, the power struggles, the competing factions within the nation, the eventual formation of Malcolm's independent organizations. But the personal, theological, deeply human crisis that preceded all of that The specific night in a Chicago study where a son figure confronted a father figure about betrayal that struck at the core of everything the relationship had been built upon receives far less attention. It deserves more, because what happened in that house was not merely organizational politics. It was a precise moment when Malcolm X, the most devoted believer the Nation of Islam ever produced, began the process of becoming someone who could question, independently and without permission, the very foundations of his own faith. That capacity for independent questioning, forged in the specific crucible of that midnight confrontation, is what allowed Malcolm to later undertake the pilgrimage to Mecca with genuine openness, to encounter Orthodox Islam without the filtered Nation of Islam doctrine, to evolve his understanding of race and religion in ways that the rigid Malcolm of 1962 could never have managed. The man who emerged from Elijah Muhammad's house at 2:30 a.m. that morning in April 1963 was carrying a wound that would not heal quickly. But that wound, painful as it was, created the opening through which everything Malcolm became afterward eventually grew. Betty Shabazz spoke about this period only rarely in the years after Malcolm's death. But in one interview, she offered description that captured something essential about what changed in her husband after that night. He had been a man certain of his foundation, she said, certain in a way that gave him enormous strength, but also limited what he could see. After Chicago, he was less certain, and that uncertainty was painful for him. But it was also the beginning of him becoming bigger than the role he had been playing. He started asking questions he had never let himself ask before, about the nation, about Islam itself, about what he actually believed versus what he had been told to believe. That night cost him something he never fully got back, a kind of innocent, absolute faith. But what he gained eventually was a capacity to think for himself completely, without anyone's permission, including his own previous self. Malcolm X had built his entire public identity on absolute conviction. The midnight visit to Elijah Muhammad's house in April 1963 was the moment that conviction first cracked, privately, invisibly, 3 hours in a small study that history has never been able to fully document, but that everyone who knew Malcolm agreed had changed him permanently. He drove home in silence that night. He never fully spoke about what was said, but he was never, by every account from everyone who loved him, quite the same man again.